This is not a quick speed shop. If you ever want to know the difference between a full-size Ford Flathead and a 60 horsepower Ford Flathead, I just happen to have two side by side, and we're going to look at them, and I'll tell you what's different about them, starting right now. I'm a professional, don't try this at home. Alright, so if you've been following along on the channel, I just pulled the 60 horsepower Flathead V8 out of my 37 Ford. And if this is the first time you're here, well, I've just pulled this engine out of my 37 Ford, and I've got a 59 AB full-size Flathead that's going to go back in its place. So I thought it'd be a good opportunity to do a video to show the differences. A lot of you are probably familiar with the full-size Flathead, but probably haven't seen a 60 horse Flathead. The Ford Flathead started out this size, the full size, in 1932. Originally it had 21 head studs, and it had the water pumps up in the front of the head here. They did that from 1932 to 1936. In 1937 they switched over to the center outlet the head with the center outlet here, and they put the water pumps into the block starting 37, but they were still 21 stud, had 3 studs in a row from 37 to mid 38. And then mid 38 all the way up to 1948, they went to the 24 stud head, which has got on this engine. This is like a 46 to 48 engine here. But in 1937, Ford came out with this miniature Flathead for fuel economy, named the 60 horsepower Flathead, and this is it right here. This is a 17 stud miniature Ford Flathead. And this is a really early one. I'll show you some of the stuff up close on it to show that it's early. But this is 136 cubic inch, 2.2 liter. This is 239 cubic inches over here, so a big difference in cubic inch size. Ford came out with a smaller 60 horsepower Flathead. They were in production from 1937 to 1940, and then in 1941, Ford dropped this small V8 and replaced it with a 6-cylinder Flathead they used in 1941 up into the early 50s in the cars. It's really obvious from the side here the size difference. You can see the much larger size of that Flathead versus the 60 horsepower Flathead. You can see the size of the transmissions. The box is really small in this one compared to the bigger. This is a 1939 box on this one. They're a lot smaller, but they physically bolt into the cars the same way. Up here in the front, you can see these are sitting about the same height. You can see how much taller the full-size Flathead is compared to the 60 horsepower. These are a little bit different year engines. This is a 1937 engine, and this is like a 1946 or 48 engine. The only difference on the front dress being this has the helmet style distributor that they used from 1932 up to 1941, I believe. And then this has the 42 to 48 style crab distributor on the front here. But everything else is completely different. The 60 horsepower has this one-piece timing cover that also has the engine mounts on it. And the water pumps thread into the housing here with a spanner wrench. You can see here there's like a spanner type deal. And in 1937, they had a tapered style water pump. They had a tapered seal, and then in 1938 to 40 they went to a straight seal. These are really hard to rebuild. They make parts for them, but I rebuilt one of these and it was still leaking. And the other one I put in as an old stock. You can see on the front of the 59 AB, this has the standard Flathead style water pump. From 32 to 36, the water pump was not in the block, it was in the head. But in 1937 they went down to the block like this for better cooling, and you saw this all the way up to the last Flathead in 1953 with the water pumps on the front of the block. But these are separate units that unbolt from the block itself, unlike the 60 horsepower, which they thread into the existing housing. The architecture for these engines is pretty much identical. They've got the 3 exhaust ports on each side. They've got all the valves in the block. They've got aluminum intake manifolds. This one's painted, but aluminum intake manifolds on both. I guess the generator has a smaller pulley. The bigger Flathead's got a little bit larger diameter pulley. The belt is shorter the size because the size of the engine is shorter. They both use a fuel pump mounted off the rod inside the block that pumps the fuel. The big Flatheads have a pedestal. The V8-60 the fuel pump mounts right into the intake manifold. The transmission on the 60 horsepower, you can see, is a lot smaller. It uses the same style 3-speed non-synchro transmission. Mounts on the same biscuits as a bigger engine, but the case and the box itself is smaller compared to like the 39. The bolt pattern is the same, so you could bolt a full-size transmission up to the 60 horsepower engine, but I believe the 60 horsepower engine uses an 8.5-inch diameter clutch, whereas the 59AB would have a 10-inch diameter clutch, and the a little bit earlier engines would have a 9-inch diameter clutch in them. But the transmission is physically much larger here with the full-size flathead transmission versus the 60 horsepower transmission. Also on the back of the block, you can see here, there's got some numbers. You got the 59 cast in the block. You can see how the bell housing is shaped versus the straight bell housing on the 60 horsepower. We can look at the 60 horsepower a little bit closer. Now this is an early 1937 flathead. This has the windowed front cover, which they cast this solid later because these tended to break. And this is also a very early 37 flathead. It's called the tin side flathead. If you look here, there's this weld seam around here, and there's these water elbows that are copper, or brass, I should say. This is actually a stainless steel plate that is welded into the side of the block on both sides. They cast these blocks open on the side, then they welded these plates in here. They did that from very late 36 when they came out with the engine up to mid 37, and then they stopped doing it and they went to a standard cast iron style block. So this is a very early 37 flathead 60 horsepower V8 with the water necks that curve like this. First they went to this curved elbow, then later on they came out with a straight brass elbow, and then they went to the solid block on the outside. But this is a very early one with the welded in stainless steel side panels here. So you can see that the exhaust manifolds are specific to the V8-60. They're very small, rectangular or square style exhaust manifolds. Got these very small crossover pipe. It's probably like 1.25 inch, I'd say, diameter pipe. Very small, a lot smaller than the full-size flathead. In 1937, all the 60 horsepower engines came with factory aluminum heads on them. This engine has been apart before. It has a Ford head on this side with the part number in the head and the Ford logo here. The head on the other side, it says Made in USA. This is a reproduction head from back in the day. But somebody has obviously taken the original aluminum heads off. They either cracked or whatever and put iron heads on this. They had a lot of failures, I guess, the aluminum heads back in the early days. So this says iron heads on it. But all 1937 Ford 60 horsepower engines had aluminum heads to begin with. The aluminum head, the aluminum intake. The transmissions, like I said, are very small. They got this very small little cluster set of gears in here. A lot smaller than the gears in the bigger transmission. You can see those. You still get the serial number up on the transmission for the engine number, but instead of the full-size cars that have an 18-something, this is a model 54, the 60 horsepower, so it's 54- a number, and that pertains to the frame number on the car as well. The spark plugs they use in these are a little different. I think they're the 14mm smaller spark plugs that they use in the later model engines. Whereas the earlier full-size flatheads, like the 21 studs, had a bigger spark plug. These are the modern style spark plug for the later flatheads. You still had the cloth-covered plug wires, and pretty much everything else is the same. I think the fuel pump is different. It's a little bit smaller, specific to the 60 horsepower engine. And also the carburetor. This engine doesn't have the original carburetor with it. I had a 94 carburetor on here. But originally, these carburetors were a specific Model 81 carburetor, which is specific to the 60 horsepower engines only, and people use them for multiple carburations on the full-size flatheads. So that's pretty much it. I just want to do a quick video showing the differences between the full-size flathead and the flathead 60 horsepower engine. These are a really cool idea. You see these a lot. They use them in the midget cars that they race in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Most all the midget cars that weren't 4 cylinders were 60 horsepower engines. They also took these and they put them in hydroplane boats and they ran them in hydroplanes. They make a lot of speed equipment parts that are very, very rare and very expensive for these engines. You can get parts. It's called a jiggler. It's like an overhead valve conversion that they ran in the midget cars. You can get Arden heads for these, which are extremely hard to find and very expensive. You're talking like $25,000 to put in the 60 horsepower. But it's a neat little engine, an idea that Ford had, trying to be frugal back in the day. Oh, one more thing to mention: these came in the 37 to 40 Ford cars. You got the lightweight wheels. You got the wheels that were 3.5 inches wide with a 550/16 tire. You got a 444 rear end gear instead of 378, which would have been standard on all the cars from 37 to 40, with 411 being an option. All the 60 horsepower cars got a 444 rear end gear with a 455 option. So it gave you the lighter engine with more lower numerical gear or higher numerical gear ratio to give you more torque to get out of the hole with the smaller engine. This engine's only got about 100 foot-pounds of torque, and that's not very much to move a decent-sized Ford car. But the 444 rear end gear made this car top out about 50-55 miles an hour, similar when all the other cars of the era were able to do like 70-75. So it was pretty much limited this to like a small backwoods around town cruising car, not a super highway cruising machine with the 60 horsepower car. So I'm converting my 37 Ford over to the 59AB with a 39 transmission box with a better synchros, and I'm using a 48 Ford rear end that has a 378 gear ratio, so I can have a car that will do 65 miles an hour instead of the 50-55 that it would do with the 60 horsepower. So that's what I'm doing, and we're going from little flathead to big flathead. So there you go, just a little flathead action for you here today from the Quick Speed Shop. If you want to see other hot rod stuff, I got all kinds of builds going on. I put out videos Wednesdays and Saturdays. Appreciate watching. Please subscribe, tell your friends, and I'll see you right back here at the Quick Speed Shop.